Imagine a world where your house is not, it's not just a piece of real estate you buy.
Right.
It is not a property you bid on against 12 other people. It's not framed out by contractors. And it absolutely does not require a 30-year mortgage that, tethers you to a bank for the prime decades of your adult life.
Which is pretty much everyone's reality right now.
Exactly. Instead, I want you to imagine that your shelter is a living organism,
Yeah.
something you cultivate from a seed, something you bond with physically and psychologically, and eventually pass down. A shelter that literally asks for nothing but your time and your physical presence.
It is a premise that fundamentally assaults our modern economic conditioning.
Oh, absolutely.
We are so entrenched in this idea of shelter as a finite commodity, right? Like a physical asset that is purchased, leased, heavily taxed, traded.
Yeah, the housing market.
Right. But if your home is grown rather than built, that entire paradigm fractures. The concept of the home transitions from a depreciating or appreciating financial asset into an active biological relationship.
And that exact transition is the engine driving our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We are pulling apart this truly fascinating stack of source material today.
Yeah, this one is really special.
It is. It's the showrunner Bible for a near-future narrative project called Suveron.
Suveron, yeah.
And this document, it acts as the architectural blueprint for a sprawling 5-season chronological arc. It outlines a world where a decentralized network of ordinary people begins to bond with these organic, living dwellings.
Which they call kiths.
Right, kiths. And inevitably, the massive systems that currently profit from artificial scarcity, they realize what is happening and they start hunting them down.
Because of course they do.
Of course.
What makes this specific document so compelling to analyze is the rigorous sociological framework the creators have built here. They aren't just, sketching out a neat science fiction aesthetic.
Right, it's not just cool biotech.
Exactly. They are constructing a very deliberate thematic collision. The writers are pitting a pure gift economy, a biological system that asks nothing in return for shelter against the global world economy, which they frame as a system demanding constant extraction.
They use this narrative to really force the audience to reconsider the artificial scarcity of our own world, framing concepts like rent and property taxes as a form of, slow, normalized violence.
Yeah, and it is vital to note that this is entirely the perspective of the show's creators.
Yes, very important point.
They are using this fictional universe as a sandbox to critique modern capitalism and real estate markets. We are just reporting on what they built.
Right. Our mission today is to trace exactly how they map that critique across a timeline. We are going to unpack this 5-season progression, tracking how a localized biological anomaly evolves into a decentralized resistance and eventually into a deeply philosophical, almost startling completion endgame.
We aren't just looking at world building.
No, we are tracking the anatomy of a paradigm shift.
The creators are also hyper-specific about the tone they want to achieve with this show.
Yeah, it's not what you'd expect.
Not at all. The text explicitly states that this is not a loud dystopian action thriller.
No laser guns?
No neon-soaked cyberpunk cities or firefights. The writers lean heavily on what they call the cyclo principle, which is a direct reference to the 1995 Vietnamese film Cyclo.
Oh, I hadn't made that connection at first.
Yeah, the mandate is to drop the viewer directly into the raw, unpolished texture of existence. There is no heavy exposition.
Right, no narrator explaining everything.
The characters do not stop to explain the rules of the world to the camera. You simply watch people live. You feel the weight of their daily labor, the oppressive heat of the environment, and the quiet, rhythmic hum of these living houses.
That immediately changes the pacing, I think. It demands active viewing from you as the audience.
Totally.
If characters in this universe use a highly specific piece of regional slang, the show trusts you to use context clues to figure it out.
Yeah, they treat the audience like adults.
And before this living network can grow large enough to threaten global markets, it first has to be uncovered by individuals. Which brings us right to the starting line, Season 1.
Which is entirely categorized under the theme of finding.
Finding. So finding focuses on the extreme intimacy of the initial discovery. The creators deliberately avoid the cliché of a single chosen one protagonist who is destined to save the world.
Right, there is no Luke Skywalker here.
Exactly. Instead, they structure the narrative around archetypes that pop up simultaneously across different regions. And the primary entry point for you, the viewer, is the archetype known as the Finder.
The Finder.
Yeah. This is a person who either stumbles across a dormant kith in the wild or in a much more dynamic scenario, is actively sought out by one.
And that dynamic scenario is fascinating.
Okay, let's unpack this biological mechanism, because the document describes something called a seed wing.
Yeah, the seed wing.
It's essentially a drifting dandelion-like seed, but it is actively seeking out a compatible human.
It's floating on the wind, but it possesses some level of biological agency.
Right, so if you are walking through a dense forest and this strange, fibrous piece of fluff lands on your shoulder, you aren't just brushing away a weed.
No, you are being selected by a dormant shelter.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. And the moment that seed takes root in the soil, it enters what the creators designate as the pip stage.
The pip.
Yeah. This covers the first year of its life cycle, and the biological rules here are incredibly rigid.
Very rigid.
To survive and grow, a pip requires a daily check-in, a minimum of 10 minutes of dedicated physical presence from its future primary inhabitant.
And it has to be daily.
Every single day. It is a highly specific imprinting process.
And that 10-minute mechanic, that is the exact mechanism that completely subverts the real estate market in this fictional universe.
Yes, because you can't game it.
You can't. You're essentially trying to tame a remarkably slow architectural entity.
Yeah.
You cannot skip a day. You cannot fake the biological signature. If you do not put in those 10 minutes of physical proximity and presence every single day for a full year, the kith simply will not bond with you. It will remain inert.
This is where the creators' critique of capital becomes incredibly sharp, I think.
Oh, for sure.
They have designed a system that completely neutralizes financial leverage. A billionaire cannot purchase their way into a fully matured, bonded kith.
They can't just buy it off someone else.
No, and they can't hire a surrogate to sit in the dirt and imprint on the structure for them either.
Because the kith will only recognize the specific biological and behavioral signature of the person who tended it.
Exactly. If a stranger approaches, they get a minimal, closed-off response. Shelter is entirely decoupled from wealth and explicitly wedded to care, attention, and time.
The one resource that cannot be artificially mass-produced.
Exactly. Time.
So Season 1 is essentially a collection of these quiet, high-stakes acts of care. We are watching a finder, perhaps deep in the Appalachian Mountains, meticulously tending to this vulnerable pip.
Just putting in the time.
Yeah. And because the narrative is decentralized, you see these discoveries happening across vastly different geographic regions simultaneously. And naturally, these isolated people don't have a standardized manual.
Right. There's no instruction booklet for a living house.
So they develop their own regional vocabulary for what they're growing.
The sociology of the language here is a brilliant touch by the writers. The text notes that people instinctively reach for the language of their ancestors or their specific terrain to describe this unknown phenomenon.
Which makes total sense.
Yeah. So in Appalachia, the structure is referred to as a holler, reflecting the geography they inhabit.
Oh, I love that.
In the Pacific Northwest, they revive the older English term kith, which denotes familiar friends or a network of relationships.
Down in the Southwest, it becomes a covo, right?
Right, deriving from Spanish or Italian roots for a den or a safe hideaway. Among the Chinese diaspora, it is called shenwu, translating to spirit dwelling.
It's just incredible world building.
It is. Eventually, as these isolated pockets start to realize they aren't alone, a formal, network-wide term emerges.
Blue. Derived from the Old Norse word for bloom.
Exactly.
But the tension of the narrative relies on the fact that these quiet, localized acts of tending, they cannot go unnoticed forever.
No, the systems of power always catch on.
They do. They begin to detect anomalies. The Showrunner Bible introduces the opposing archetype here, which is the hunter.
The hunters.
Yeah, these are the individuals employed by the state or corporate entities to track down and neutralize these biological structures.
And you have to look closely at the terminology the opposition employs here, because it is an exercise in deliberate psychological distancing.
Oh, they strip all the humanity out of it.
Totally. The official bureaucratic designation is UBDS, Unregistered Biogenic Dwelling Structure.
UBDS.
It is sterile, it is clinical, it strips away all of the relational living qualities of the organism. And on the street level, the hunters use the derogatory term blob.
Blob. That's so demeaning.
The creators are showing how institutions frame something as a biohazard, a zoning violation, or a structural threat in order to justify its eradication.
Because if the institutions acknowledge that a blob is actually a peaceful, living entity that provides free shelter, they instantly lose the moral high ground.
Precisely. The text frames this opposition as an immune response from the global economy.
Like a virus.
Right. If a critical mass of the population suddenly does not have to pay rent or take out a mortgage, the core engines of banking and real estate just collapse.
The showrunner Bible grounds this entire conflict in a specific philosophical interpretation of the Tao Te Ching.
Yes.
The creators draw heavily from a translation that emphasizes the earthy, pictographic roots of the original text. They focus specifically on the concept of the hollow.
The hollow.
Yeah, the foundational quote they use is, 30 spokes share one hub. Where there is nothing, the cart is useful.
That is so key to understanding this world.
It really is. The kith operates on this exact principle.
Yeah.
It is a hollow vessel. Its entire utility is derived from its emptiness.
It provides the exact parameters of shelter and sustenance required for life and absolutely nothing more.
It is a machine of sufficiency, not abundance.
And that presents a massive ideological friction point. The concept of sufficiency is entirely alien to the hunters and the corporate structures they represent.
Right, because they only understand endless accumulation.
Endless accumulation and perpetual growth. When the opposition looks at a kith, their immediate questions are, how can we scale this? How can we patent the genome? How can we monetize the output?
How do we sell it back to people?
Exactly. But the kith physically resists scaling for profit. It is designed only to maintain a state of equilibrium for a single user or family.
The central conflict established in the first season is not a war of weapons. It's a war of fundamental worldviews.
Yeah, a clash of paradigms.
It is the friction between a macroeconomic system demanding infinite growth on a finite planet and a localized biological structure that provides exactly enough and then commands you to rest.
Commands you to rest. That's beautiful.
It is. And as the first season concludes, these dedicated tenders successfully navigate that grueling one-year imprinting phase. The pips solidify. They transition into functional shelters. And suddenly, this isolated, localized anomaly begins to stretch its roots.
Which introduces a completely new set of logistical challenges.
Because once you survive the imprinting phase, you actually have to figure out how to live inside this organism full-time.
Right. How does a localized secret become an interconnected, decentralized movement?
Which brings us to season 2, right? Categorized as growing.
Growing, yeah.
And the most immediate, glaring hurdle of living off the grid inside a biological house is sustenance. You still have to eat.
You do. And the creators tackle this with incredible mechanical rigor. Season 2 delves into the practical daily realities of kith life. They explicitly describe the kith not as a magical provider, but as a practical chemistry tutor.
A practical chemistry tutor. Now, this was the point in the source material where I was actively searching for the catch.
Right, you were looking for the flaw.
Because if the house just materializes a hot meal out of thin air, it crosses the line from grounded sci-fi into pure fantasy.
It would be like a Star Trek replicator.
Exactly, which completely removes all narrative tension.
The text avoids that trap by introducing a concept they call the throttle.
The throttle.
Yeah. The ancient technology governing the kiths possesses strict, unbreakable constraints. The kith cannot perform alchemy. It cannot transmute base elements into entirely different elements, and it certainly cannot create matter from raw energy.
It is a highly efficient, but entirely closed-loop chemical synthesizer.
Right. So the mechanics of getting a meal require immense human effort. The document states that it takes 4 to 6 hours for a kith to synthesize a single day's worth of food.
That's a long time.
It is. And more importantly, the kith doesn't generate the raw material.
Right. The tender has to physically go out into the environment and forage for the exact molecular feedstock required.
This is where it gets really gritty.
If you want the kith to synthesize protein, you have to supply it with nitrogen. That means you are out in the woods, digging up lagoon roots, gathering decomposing plant matter, or harvesting animal waste.
Not glamorous at all.
No. And if you are anemic and need the kith to synthesize iron for your blood, you have to hike out and find red, iron-rich rocks, or literal rust.
Literal rust, yeah.
If you need iodine to regulate your thyroid, you have to source seaweed or coastal soil.
This specific constraint forces a brilliant narrative dynamic.
Boy, it really does.
The tenders cannot simply lock themselves inside their living houses and isolate themselves from the world. They are driven by a foraging imperative.
They have to leave the house.
They have to leave. And because natural resources are geographically locked, you aren't going to find oceanic iodine in the mountains of Appalachia, it forces the isolated tenders to interact.
It necessitates movement.
Exactly. It organically builds a shadow economy. We start seeing trade routes forming based purely on mutual aid and molecular necessity.
Completely bypassing traditional currency.
Right, there's no money involved.
It's a logistical necessity that creates immediate danger, though, because movement exposes you to the hunters.
Yeah, you step outside, you're at risk.
And this need for movement introduces a second major archetype into the world, the carrier.
The carriers are so cool.
They really are. These are individuals who take on the massive risk of transporting dormant pips or vital molecular supplies across hostile, monitored territories.
They are the arteries of this emerging shadow economy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. While the carriers are physically moving across the surface, the kiths themselves are solving the communication problem in their own way.
Oh, the mesh.
The mesh, the invisible communication architecture connecting the network.
And the mechanics of the mesh are just staggering. The writers didn't just say, oh, they communicate telepathically.
Right, they didn't take the easy way out.
They mapped out a deeply plausible, multi-layered system designed specifically to evade modern surveillance.
Let's dig into how these layers actually function, because this blew my mind. Starting with layer 1, the mycelial bioelectric layer.
This is the deepest and slowest form of communication. The kiths tap into the existing natural fungal networks beneath the topsoil, the mycorrhizal networks.
Right.
They send weak bioelectric pulses through the fungal threads. The document compares the data transfer rate to a 1990s dial-up modem.
Wow, that's slow.
Excruciatingly slow, but it is effectively invisible. If a hunter team runs a ground-penetrating radar or an electromagnetic sweep, the data transmission just looks like standard biological background noise.
That is so smart. And layer 2 gets even more rudimentary, the seismic or acoustic layer.
Yeah.
If a kith is in an area without dense fungal networks, say a highly rocky terrain, it utilizes low-frequency vibrations,
It essentially thumps against solid bedrock.
sending acoustic waves that can travel for kilometers. The data rate is agonizingly slow, maybe 10 to 100 bits per second. But it blends in perfectly with natural microseismic activity or the distant rumble of human infrastructure.
It just sounds like a distant truck driving by.
Exactly. Then there's layer 3, the atmospheric scatter, which handles continental communication.
This one is so cinematic.
It really is. The kiths don't transmit constantly. They wait for specific astronomical events, like meteor showers burning up in the upper atmosphere.
And in that brief window, they fire burst transmissions into the sky, bouncing the data off the ionized trails left by the meteors.
To any corporate listening post, it registers as a momentary blip of static or natural radio interference.
It reads like organic espionage.
It totally does. Layer 4 is highly physical. The seed data packets.
Oh, the archive seeds.
The kiths engineer spores that look like ordinary airborne seeds, but their internal structure is encoded with DNA-like molecular storage. These seeds can hold gigabytes of accumulated data.
And the kith just releases them into the wind.
Completely passive.
It's entirely passive. The spore drifts until another kith's root system or external sensors capture it and decode the genetic sequence.
And finally, for kiths operating dangerously close to civilization, there is layer 5. Infrastructure parasitic,
This is where they hack the cities.
basically. The organic structure extends tendrils that wrap around municipal power lines or subterranean water pipes.
They induce incredibly subtle electrical signals directly into the city grid, camouflaging their data packets within the normal, chaotic line noise of urban power consumption.
It is the sheer overwhelming redundancy of these 5 layers that makes the mesh nearly impossible to destroy.
Yeah, you can cut the power lines, but the fungal network remains. You can poison the soil, but the atmospheric scatter continues.
It's brilliantly designed.
Yeah.
And as this complex, multi-layered mesh begins to hum with data, we are introduced to the most enigmatic archetype in the showrunner Bible, the Avens.
The Avens.
The writers are very careful to explicitly state what an Aven is not.
Right, they're not leaders.
They are not the leaders of the resistance, they are not religious figures,
Right.
and they are not issuing commands through the mesh.
The document conceptualizes them as deep system observers or philosophical investigative reporters.
I love that description.
An Aven is an individual who has cultivated such a profound, quiet relationship with the network that they begin to perceive the macro patterns of the mesh.
They see the big picture.
Right. They hold the institutional memory of the network, carrying knowledge that is never written down or stored in a central database. They listen with total absorption.
And the name itself is fascinating. The notes indicate that Aven sounds like ravens or events.
It has a weight to it.
And there is a highly specific, almost mystical mechanic to how someone becomes one. You don't just sign up.
No, there's no application form.
The text describes encounters where a person in a heavily liminal state, perhaps they are teetering on the edge of sleep or experiencing extreme physical trauma and near death, hears the word Aven.
And that word literally burns itself into their consciousness.
It isn't a superpower. It is a psychological brand, indicating that the vast, decentralized intelligence of the network has recognized them.
It acts as a profound calling. The archetype of the Aven is defined by solitude, patience, and a severe sensitivity to shame.
Sensitivity to shame.
Yeah. The writers note that if an Aven is forced to use physical violence to solve a problem, they view it as a catastrophic personal failure, even if the violence saves lives.
Wow. That's a heavy burden.
They operate on a Taoist principle of being sheep-skilled. This means possessing a quiet, practical competence and exerting influence through patient attention rather than aggressive ideological force.
But the global economy doesn't operate on patient attention.
Not at all.
As the Kith network rapidly expands, trading molecular feedstocks and syncing data across the invisible mesh, the corporate and state opposition begins to heavily organize.
You cannot disrupt the foundational pillars of the economy without triggering a massive systemic retaliation.
And the retaliation mapped out by the writers is highly realistic. It doesn't start with military strikes.
Right, it starts with paper.
It starts with the weaponization of bureaucracy.
The banking sector, the real estate developers, and the municipal governments don't even need to formally conspire. Their financial incentives naturally align.
They begin issuing catastrophic building code violations against suspected properties.
They manipulate zoning laws.
They run aggressive, coordinated media campaigns, framing the blobs as dangerous disease vectors or structurally unstable hazards that threaten community safety.
It is an escalation of systemic pressure. Death by 1,000 bureaucratic paper cuts slowly morphs into literal death by tactical raid teams.
The text outlines scenarios where Homeland Security agencies begin physically infiltrating tender communities, executing midnight raids, and seizing the highly vulnerable PIPs.
The pressure dial reaches a breaking point, forcing the narrative into the brutal, oppressive atmosphere of Season 3.
Which operates under the banner of hiding.
Hiding. And the thematic tension here relies entirely on the biological limitations of the Kiths.
Because in a standard science fiction narrative, when the oppressive regime brings the hammer down, the rebellion arms itself. You expect the tenders to bioengineer their Kiths to go organic armor plating or weaponize the chemical synthesizers to produce toxins or projectiles.
That is exactly the narrative pivot I was anticipating while reading the outline. I thought the Kiths were going to evolve from peaceful shelters into biological war machines to fight off the tactical raid teams.
Right. But the writers deliberately deny you that catharsis.
They do. They establish that the ancient creators of this technology, a mysterious entity referred to as the Gardeners, hard-coded an unbreakable genetic throttle into the Kiths.
The organism is physically incapable of constructing weaponry or mechanisms of locomotion like vehicles.
The technology is absolutely constrained by a philosophy of nonviolence. Therefore, when faced with overwhelming kinetic force, the network's only defense mechanism is evasion.
It sinks.
It sinks.
The document calls this mechanism going burrow, and the sheer mechanical reality of this is agonizing.
It sounds claustrophobic just reading it.
A Kith can burrow deep underground to escape detection, but it can only physically displace and compress the surrounding soil at a maximum rate of roughly 1 meter per week.
1 meter a week.
It is not an escape pod. It is a painfully slow, deliberate retreat into the darkness while the raid teams are actively searching the surface.
This burrowing mechanic serves as the physical manifestation of the Taoist principle of Wu Wei, or dancing without forcing.
Dancing without forcing.
The Kith network acts like water. It does not crash against the rock of the state. It finds the low ground and yields to the pressure.
It sinks beneath the hostile surface and perfectly camouflages its biological signature with the surrounding deep earth.
The psychological toll this inflicts on the human characters is a massive focus of this era.
I can't even imagine. We are talking about entire communities retreating into deep subterranean isolation, living in total darkness.
And because they are buried so deep beneath the bedrock, they lose access to the faster layers of the mesh.
The text describes regions where the network goes completely dark. The isolation is absolute. You are sitting in the dark, meticulously managing the chemical synthesis of your air and food, simply waiting for the hunter's seismic sensors to pass over you.
And yet they attempt to maintain connection. The burrowed kiths extend incredibly thin, delicate periscope filaments.
Oh, right, the periscopes.
Hair-like tendrils that push through the soil to the surface just to catch a fleeting burst of atmospheric scatter beta, or they rely entirely on the low-frequency acoustic thumping to relay messages.
It is an era defined by extreme physical and psychological compression. And within this oppressive atmosphere, the writers introduce a highly compelling narrative thread. A specific kith in its tender who stubbornly refused to hide.
That presents a fascinating logistical nightmare for the network.
Because the survival of the whole depends on total invisibility.
If one tender stands their ground and says, "No, I am not retreating into the dirt, we have a biological right to the sun," it threatens the entire region.
The internal friction between the deeply pacifist hidden network and this one visible act of defiance is incredible dramatic fuel.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, while the tenders are enduring this subterranean trauma, the writers also focus on the psychological degradation of the hunters.
Yes, the bad guys are starting to break down too.
The corporate and state agents were deployed under the assumption that they were eradicating a violent biohazard or a sophisticated terror network.
But the reality on the ground creates massive cognitive dissonance.
Because when a tactical team breaches a suspected site, what do they actually find?
They find a terrified family tending to an organic structure that harms absolutely nothing.
They find people foraging for red clay to synthesize iron.
There is no stockpile of weapons, there is no manifesto, there's just an organism trying to quietly keep people alive.
And the writers refuse to render the hunters as cartoonish villains. They are depicted as human beings operating within a system of comprehensible, albeit misguided, financial incentives.
Over the course of Season 3, that systemic justification crumbles. The hunters begin to experience profound moral doubt.
The realization sets in that they are not acting as the protectors of public safety. They are functioning purely as the violent immune system for the commercial real estate market.
That widespread loss of faith among the enforcement class creates the exact vulnerability needed for the narrative to pivot into Season 4.
The physical and psychological compression of the Going Burrow era cannot be maintained indefinitely.
You can only compress a spring for so long.
Right. The network has to equalize.
The outline titles Season 4 Surfacing, describing it as the turn.
The turn.
The network evolves from a fragmented subterranean survival mechanism into an undeniable, globally mature presence.
The timeline progresses significantly here. The kiths transition from the juvenile stage into the mature and elder stages.
And once a kith hits that 3 to 7 year mark, its biological capabilities expand exponentially.
It is no longer just a single hollow chamber.
No, the structure can grow dedicated, specialized rooms, averaging one new room every 6 months.
They can develop organic medical bays, complex chemical workshops, or atmospheric growing chambers.
They even gain the ability to physically connect their root systems and walls with adjacent kiths. Though the text is clear that this requires the mutual biological consent of both structures and their tenders.
And if a kith survives past the 7-year mark to become an elder, the capabilities border on miraculous.
This part was amazing.
The document teases that elder kiths, once they no longer have to expend energy on camouflage and hiding, can develop advanced internal capabilities like organic VR or holographic projections.
They transform from mere survival bunkers into vastly complex hubs of human and biological interaction.
However, the surfacing of these highly capable, mature structures inevitably attracts a new type of threat.
The final antagonistic archetype.
The seller.
The opportunists. These are individuals who look at the miraculous, life-sustaining capabilities of a mature kith and immediately attempt to run it through a capitalistic framework.
They view it as an unmonetized asset.
They attempt to sell the kiths, lease the rooms, or charge for the synthesized materials.
And the writers ensure that the sellers fail completely, every single time.
Beautifully.
Their failure is a mechanical certainty, rooted in the biology of the organism. You cannot transact the imprinting bond.
Right. If a seller attempts to hand over a mature kith to a paying buyer, the organism will simply reject the stranger.
It will cease chemical synthesis, it will not regulate temperature, it will close itself off and slowly enter a state of total dormancy.
The sellers serve a highly specific thematic purpose for the writers. They are the definitive visual proof that this technology is immune to capitalism.
That systemic rejection forces the final fracture of the opposition. The showrunner Bible details massive, coordinated emergence events in Season 4.
The tenders collectively realize that the hunters no longer have the moral or numerical strength to stop them.
So the Kiths rise from the earth en masse.
The trillion-dollar corporate coalition that spent years hunting them completely splinters. Hardliners still push for total eradication, but corporate pragmatists suddenly attempt to co-opt the network.
They want to capture the Kiths, reverse engineer the genome, break the non-violent genetic throttle, and transform the organism into a patentable consumer product.
The writers frame this conflict through another direct application of the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah, they draw a stark contrast between two irreconcilable operational philosophies.
The text defines the way of the sky as a system that naturally takes from what has excess and distributes it to what is lacking, constantly seeking a state of equilibrium.
Opposing this is the way of people, which is the writer's explicit metaphor for the global economy.
Which functions by taking from the lacking and funneling it upward to the excess.
Exactly. And the surfacing of the global Kith network forces an absolute, unavoidable reckoning between these two systems.
They cannot coexist. If an indestructible biological network guarantees free shelter, pure water, and synthesized food for the entire global population, the primary leverage of the way of people evaporates instantly.
The institutions of power lose their grip because they can no longer utilize the threat of homelessness or starvation to compel labor.
This global paradigm shift deeply impacts the Avens. Their entire identity is built around solitary observation and remaining hidden in the liminal spaces.
But the massive societal upheaval of Season 4 forces them out of the shadows.
To protect the integrity of the mesh during the emergence events, the Avens must step forward, acting publicly and utilizing their deep systemic knowledge to coordinate the surfacing.
They have to risk their cherished anonymity.
Now, if Suveron were following a traditional narrative arc, the conclusion of Season 4 would serve as the series finale.
The decentralized resistance surfaces, the oppressive corporate monopolies shatter, and the living network blooms across the planet, providing shelter for everyone.
It is the ultimate utopian victory.
But the showrunner Bible deliberately pushes past that victory condition, moving into the highly philosophical territory of Season 5 and beyond.
Categorized as completing.
Completing, yeah. The writers use this final era to ask a profoundly unsettling question.
What actually happens to a resistance movement after Happily Ever After?
Let's set the environmental stage for this endgame. We are looking at a far future scenario.
The era of the hunters and the going burrow trauma is relegated to history.
The Kiths are ubiquitous. The mesh is fully unthrottled, operating openly and connecting the entire globe. Humanity has effectively achieved a post-scarcity reality regarding their foundational biological needs.
And in the midst of this utopia, the Avens, who continue to act as the quiet stewards of the mesh, begin to detect alarming anomalies.
Dark spots begin appearing across the global communication network.
These aren't violent drop-offs. Entire regional clusters of Kiths are simply going quiet.
The structures aren't dying or decaying, but they are entering a profound, unresponsive dormancy.
The writers include a brilliant atmospheric detail here. In these quiet zones, the wild, undomesticated animal populations begin to return in massive numbers.
It is as if the subtle, organizing hum of the mesh has gently evaporated, allowing raw nature to reclaim the space.
The Avens, conditioned by generations of conflict, assume the worst. They hypothesize that a remnant faction of the old corporate world has engineered a biological virus or a disruptive frequency to attack the network.
So they organize an expedition into one of these expanding dark spots, fully prepared to confront a new existential threat.
But when they arrive at the epicenter, they don't find a corporate stronghold or a weaponized pathogen.
They find a single individual named Nil. Nil is arguably the most conceptually terrifying character in the entire document, precisely because he is completely benign.
He is sitting quietly at the center of the dormant zone. He welcomes the Avens and peacefully offers them tea.
He hasn't hacked the mesh. He hasn't poisoned the root systems. He is entirely innocent.
So what does this all mean? That presents a massive logical puzzle. If Nil is not attacking the infrastructure, why is the global network dying around him?
The writers define this crisis as the completion problem. Nil didn't destroy the Kiths, he simply stopped needing them.
That concept is staggering. He stopped needing.
The foundational operating system of the Kith network is human necessity. The writers reveal that the ancient desperation of humanity, the raw biological desire for safety, warmth, and sustenance, is the actual frequency that the mesh responds to.
The entire organism feeds on the energy of human wanting.
But Nil no longer wants anything. He hasn't reached this state through grueling asceticism or forced deprivation. He has simply organically arrived at a state of absolute, unshakable sufficiency.
He is completely whole.
And because he possesses absolutely no unmet needs, he ceases to broadcast that invisible frequency of desperation.
The biological network surrounding him was engineered solely to answer the call of human need. When that call goes silent, the highly efficient organism has no function left to perform.
So it does exactly what nature dictates. It powers down, it folds up, it rests.
This revelation forces the Avens to confront the ultimate mystery of the gardeners, the ancient entities that seeded this technology.
The text asks, was this living network ever intended to be a permanent fixture of the human experience? Or was it meticulously designed as a temporary bridge?
A bridge engineered specifically to carry humanity out of an era of manufactured scarcity and into an era of total biological and psychological sufficiency.
And once humanity successfully crosses that bridge, the structure is programmed to dismantle itself.
To contextualize this, the writers pull one final concept from ancient philosophy: the straw dogs.
In specific historical rituals, straw dogs were elaborately crafted, highly revered objects. For the duration of the ceremony, they were treated with absolute sacredness.
But the exact moment the ritual concluded, they were tossed aside or burned.
They were never meant to be hoarded or clung to. Their value was entirely tied to their temporary utility.
The writers are positioning the entire Kith network as a massive biological straw dog for the human race.
It absorbs our trauma, protects us from the elements, and dismantles the coercive economic systems that exploit our need for shelter.
But it honors humanity by eventually letting go. It refuses to become a new form of permanent dependency.
This raises an important question, though. This endgame creates a devastating existential crisis for the characters, specifically the Avens.
Because they've constructed their entire cultural identity around the defense and maintenance of this network.
The text leaves them wrestling with an impossible question. Is completion actually a victory, or is it the ultimate loss?
If you dedicate generations to fighting for a specific cause, and you achieve your goal so absolutely that the cause simply evaporates, what is your purpose the following morning?
The Avens are forced to mourn the death of their world, not because they were defeated, but simply because they executed their mission perfectly.
It is an incredibly melancholic, beautiful resolution. Just imagining that scene, sitting in the quiet with Nil, sharing a cup of tea, and feeling the first terrifying edge of not needing.
You realize that the absolute greatest gift this living technology can bestow upon humanity is its own permanent absence.
When you synthesize the entire journey the writers have mapped out, it is a staggering narrative achievement.
We trace the arc from the very first secretive imprinting of a tiny pip in an isolated Appalachian holler.
Watch it evolve into a sprawling, multi-layered subterranean resistance fighting a silent war against trillion-dollar conglomerates.
Only to see it voluntarily put itself to sleep because the human soul has finally achieved equilibrium.
Analyzing a document like this fundamentally shifts how you view the structures around you.
While the Kiths are entirely fictional, the writer's critique of our reality is razor-sharp.
They use a sci-fi sandbox to expose the normalized anxiety we all accept. The slow violence of the housing market, the looming dread of the first of the month, the massive cognitive load of maintaining a 30-year mortgage.
The showrunners are directly challenging you to examine your own operational programming. They're asking us, are we genuinely pursuing a state of sufficiency, or have we been completely subsumed by the momentum of accumulation?
If an anomaly like a Kith appeared tomorrow, a perfectly hollow vessel offering exactly what you require to survive and absolutely nothing more, could you accept it?
Or would your economic conditioning force you to try and build an empire out of it?
The text dares to ask if modern humanity is even capable of recognizing true sufficiency, or if you're permanently hardwired to act like hunters.
That ideological challenge lingers heavily.
It really does. But looking at the entirety of this 5-season arc leaves me with one final, deeply provocative thought to leave you with. If the writer's vision holds true, and the Kith network completely fades away once humanity achieves perfect contentment, what exactly drives human culture on the day after completion?
Yeah, without the struggle, what's left?
Exactly. If you remove the pressure of biological survival, if you erase the desire for accumulation, and if you completely eliminate the friction of wanting, Do we ascend into a state of perfect, quiet peace? Or does the sudden absence of that friction risk destroying the very engine that makes us recognizably human?
Imagine a world where your shelter is a living organism entirely devoted to your care.
And then imagine the deafening silence of the world when that organism decides you finally don't need it anymore?
It is the realization that humanity itself was always the hollow vessel.
Exactly. Something to chew on the next time you look at a skyline.